Finally, before he passed away in August 2023, Robbie Robertson discussed his rupture with Levon Helm, one of the most agonizing and protracted feuds in his life. They were more than just bandmates. They were the band's main players. One of the most powerful bands to emerge from the late 1960s and take center stage in the 1970s. They used the same stage, sound system, and lighting for many years. Then everything went sideways practically without warning. Long after the band's heyday and even after the final waltz in 1976, the unspoken animosity between the two men deepened into a decades-long schism. Many were surprised by Robbie's revelation of the true reason for the divorce, which he finally addressed before his death. What, then, did Robbie Robertson say? And why was this feud never resolved? Let's discuss every detail. The slow-burning dispute started within the band. Some of the most timeless tunes of the 1970s came from the band. Decades later, records still have the warmth and odd honesty of old records. Life within the group was never as simple as it sounded on vinyl, despite the music they produced. It wasn't the end that caused the fissures. Long before anyone referred to it as a quarrel, they were already there, silently assembling. Something had already changed by 1976, when the last waltz's last notes rang out. They held their smiles a bit too long. The conversation ended abruptly. And the moment the curtain dropped, everything fell apart. What transpired was a breach between Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm that would become a lifetime rift. However, there was a very different story before the animosity, blame, and decades of bitterness. It all started years ago, long before farewell concerts and packed arenas. Prior to being a band, they were the Hawks, a rough-and-tumble Toronto-based supporting group for rockabilly vocalist Ronnie Hawkins. Joining in 1957 and settling down as the full-time drummer after graduating from high school in 1958, Levon Helm had been there the longest. He traveled a great distance from Arkansas to Ontario, bringing the rhythms of the South to chilly Canadian venues. Others fell into place one after the other. Followed by Robbie Robertson, Rick Dano, and Richard Manuel. Hutch. Stan Celeste was involved for a while as well. Hawkins was an excellent band leader and a tight ship. He didn't compete with up-and-coming musicians, instead, he took inspiration from them. As a result, he took Robertson, Dano, and Manuel under his wing and they began performing nightly in Hamilton and Toronto. Hawkins's performance turned into a test. Hard timetables and no shortcuts. You either didn't last or learned quickly. Hawkins, Helm, and Robertson started to regularly appear at Pop Ivy's Summer Garden Pavilion in Port Dover, Ontario, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Hawkins invited 17-year-old Rick Danko into the group after spotting him performing at the pavilion in May 1961. It was at the same location that Hawkins and Hawks members first saw Richard Manuel and his band, the Rebels, perform. That moment remained. Hawkins soon took charge of Manuel's team. He also persuaded Manuel to depart and sign with the Hawks by September 1961. It was most difficult to win over Hudson. He was different from the others, he had a plan and a college degree. He didn't want to pursue club engagements, he wanted to teach music. He considered rock and roll to be a secondary hobby. The Hawks were unable to overlook his contributions, though. He was a brave, energetic, and entirely original organ player. Hudson eventually consented to participate after being asked several times, but only on his terms. He was paid $10 per week by each member to teach music. They would purchase a high-end Lowrey reorgan for him, and he would handle all inquiries about music theory. It was an issue of structure more than hubris, and it gradually established a tone that would be important later. They gained a reputation as the tightest rock group in Toronto's flourishing scene by recording a few tracks with Hawkins. The club lights weren't the end of the rehearsals. After lengthy performances, Hawkins frequently insisted on all-night practices, forcing the band to hone their craft out of pure need. However, the control had a price. They became restless over time. They have had enough of performing the same tunes. Their goal was to write their own. Additionally, Hawkins' management style was stale. Concerned that bringing girlfriends to shows would reduce attendance, he penalized them. Cannabis was strictly prohibited. The rules accumulated. The liberation faded. The breach was unavoidable by late 1963. Eventually, their conflicts caused them to part ways with Hawkins. And they had their own for the first time. As if they were experimenting on identities, they went through names. The first was the brief expansion of the Levon Helm sex with saxophonist Jerry Penfound. They changed their name to Levon and the Hawks after Penfound departed. Later that year, they returned to Levon and the Hawks for a recording session with Atco after releasing a single under the moniker The Canadian Squires in 1965. They met blues great Sonny Boy Williamson at about the same time, and they wanted to be his supporting band. Nothing came of the scheme. Soon after they met, Williamson passed away. The pivotal moment then arrived. After hiring them as his backing band for his U.S. tour later in 1965, Bob Dylan embarked on the infamous World Tour in 1966. Dylan assisted them in moving to Sager Ties, New York, when that storm passed. There, they recorded the casual, private sessions that would eventually become the Basement Tapes. These recordings served as a foundation for Big Pink's 1968 music. The band was all that the locals in the Woodstock area called them. The name just fit, Levon Helm later said. It clung. Officially, they were the band starting in 1968. Dylan would go back and work with them once again, most memorably on their tour together in 1974. Success appeared to be developing as it should on the surface. However, beneath the surface, the group's equilibrium was already changing. Roles were shifting. At first, lines were drawn silently, and the tension increased as the music continued. It was waiting, but it hadn't detonated yet. In order to see how that tension developed, you must go back to the point at which everything became more rapid. Let's go back to the year that Bob Dylan made the decision to destroy his reputation and bring a band alone. Inside the band's ascent, notoriety, drug use, and the conflict that altered everything. Bob Dylan was prepared to destroy his own reputation by the end of summer 1965. It was time for the folk prophet to go electric, and he needed a band that could handle the pressure. No, these are not yes men or session players. Actual band. Levon was highly recommended, as were the Hawks. John P. Hammond, a blues singer, understood exactly what Helm, Hudson and Robertson were capable of because he had already collaborated with them earlier that year. At about the same time, Dylan was persuaded to see them perform at a club on Yonge Street by a friend from Toronto named Mary Martin, who worked as Albert Mann's secretary. It hardly mattered if it was the Friar's Tavern or the Locked Door. Her insistence was important. Dylan needed to see these men. When he did, the choice was made quickly. Following their performance and a conversation with Robbie Robertson, Dylan asked Helman and Robertson to be his supporting band. But then, loyalty was still important. Helman Robertson returned to Dylan after just 2 performances and clarified things. They were not abandoning their band. Dylan needed all of them if he wanted them. Dylan nodded. It seemed at the moment like the chance they had been working for years. Larger stages and greater visibility. They considered themselves to be a disciplined, well-rehearsed rock and rhythm and blues group. Dylan remained primarily an acoustic protest singer in their eyes. They were yet unaware of how well-known he would become or how disgusting the reaction would be when the amplifiers turned on. From September 1965 to May 1966, they were on the road non-stop. The response was harsh as Dylan took the stage electric night after night. Purists were jeered. They yelled. The band was seen as accomplices to a crime. Dylan apparently relied heavily on amphetamines to maintain his speed as he pushed through, frequently using chemicals. A few Hawks drank from the same surplus. It was witnessed by others. For Levon Helm, it was too much. The animosity struck him hard. He completely stopped participating in the tour a little more than a month later. Instead than simply backing down, he disappeared. Helm worked on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico during that time, while the rest of the band remained on the road, remote from yelling crowds and heated discussion. This was the first significant fracture. Not loud, but telling. Between tours, Dylan and the other Hawks attempted to record, but nothing came naturally. Songs languished, studio sessions lingered, and development was excruciatingly slow. Dylan eventually moved the sessions from New York to Nashville in an attempt to gain momentum due to frustration. Robbie Robertson's guitar was plainly audible during the sessions. Most of the others weren't present. Although it wasn't yet known as partiality, things were beginning to take a different turn. Next came Europe. Dylan and the Hawks performed at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester in May 1966. Someone in the audience yelled a single word toward the end of the explosive set that would reverberate for decades. Judy. Dylan turned to the band and instructed them to play it loudly after pausing, responding that he didn't believe it, and calling the voice a liar. What came next was unvarnished, angry, and rebellious. It was no longer just music. There was conflict. After 2 months, the machine completely ceased. Dylan was hurt in a motorbike accident on July 29, 1966. There were no tours. It lost momentum. At Woodstock, New York, Dylan closed himself off. In an effort to survive, the Hawks drifted back to roadhouses and taverns, supporting anyone in need. For a second, everything seemed unclear once more. Dylan then gave them another call. He invited them to Woodstock in early 1967. A big pink mansion outside of town was rented by several members. It was dubbed Big Pink. There was no planning or polish to what transpired. Songs came up informally. Tapes did not roll under strain. It was informal, personal, and subtly innovative. When Helm returned, his presence filled the room once more, even though he had not been there at first. When those recordings ended in late 1967, the Hawks had had enough of supporting bands. They started taking their writing seriously, creating something unique. They have yet to be given a name. Stories of how it eventually stuck vary. A few names floated and were shot down. Others were only half-jokes. They eventually adopted the moniker that everyone had previously given them. They formed the band. Their 1968 debut got off to a rough start. Critics gushed. Musicians listened. The sound of the music was rooted, worn, and older than the time period in which it originated. Success came swiftly after. Louder acclaim, larger spaces, festivals, and tours. However, success wasn't shared equally. The disparity within the group increased as the attention did. Robbie Robertson started to assume greater command, authority, and direction. It seemed necessary to him. In contrast, the group was disintegrating in other ways. The usage of drugs was spreading. It was becoming less reliable. Everyone no longer had songs to provide. Levon Helm had a different opinion. Helm perceived it as a tightening of power, avarice, and the taking rather than the sharing of something. The accusations persisted but didn't blow up just yet. Silent, weighty, unsaid. Some members of the band were internally hollowed out by addiction. They continued on despite being proclaimed kings by the outside world. Tours followed albums, the music grew darker, and the lyrics began to express worry. Peace didn't come from fame. The edges became sharper. From the outside, the band appeared to be unstoppable by the early 1970s. The tension inside was boiling. Still, nobody was giving up. Nobody was prepared to acknowledge how much had changed. The fracture, however, was present and no longer hidden. There was no particular disagreement or dramatic outburst that led to that fracture. Exhaustion, irritation, and an increasing sense that the road was taking more than it was giving brought it in slowly. They were not united by fame. All the differences had been amplified. And at some point, someone had to make the final decision. It happened slowly at first, then suddenly. How brother turned against brother after the final waltz. Robbie Robertson was running on fumes by the middle of the 1970s. It was no longer a lovely road. Following Northern Lights' Southern Cross's unsatisfactory landing, touring felt risky. The band had to perform in theaters, secondary markets, and smaller venues, which made the contrast hard to overlook. This was no longer the relentless surge. This was how we survived. By 1976, a large portion of the tour felt tense and pared back, concluding in locations that subtly but unmistakably conveyed the band's current position. ZZ Top was given an opening slot at the Nashville Fairgrounds as the result of the last stretch. A moment that highlighted how much had changed. Soon afterward, everything skewed even further. In a boating accident in Texas at the beginning of September, Richard Manuel had a severe neck injury. In addition to shaking the group, it intensified a thought that Robertson had been harboring for some time. It was no longer sustainable to tour with him. It was careless. He advocated for the band to cease performing live and suggested a farewell show that would, at least in theory, end the chapter amicably. What followed became a legend. The band performed the final waltz on Thanksgiving Day 1976 at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco, following a final broadcast performance in late October. Turkey dinners were provided to 5,000 patrons while the band performed. A segment of horns was set up with care. The guests were all-stars, many of whom had been a part of the band's history from the start. Former collaborators, mentors, and spirits. The atmosphere behind the scenes was less joyous. Robertson's close friend Martin Scorsese filmed the performance. It also had a feeling of finality from the beginning that not all members of the group had agreed upon. For some, it was a farewell. For others, it seemed like a predetermined choice. The band's album Islands, which fulfilled their contract and made it possible for the final waltz movie and soundtrack to proceed, was published the year later. The original lineup's last studio album was this one. In addition to interviews, several performances were shot for the movie around the same time and then incorporated into the video. By the time the documentary came out in 1978, The Last Waltz was presented as a conclusive conclusion rather than just a concert. That framing never sat well with Levon Helm. Helm subsequently stated in his memoirs that he thought The Last Waltz had never been decided by the group. He saw it as Robbie Robertson's creation, carried out according to Robertson's specifications and motivated by his vision. According to Helm, the split was not mutually agreeable and had been pushed. Robertson never claimed to be its owner. Years later, he admitted that he had made his point with the movie and the album, and he was willing to accept someone else's opinion if they didn't agree. He was okay with it if it remained his vision alone. He had no remorse about claiming it because he felt the movie spoke for itself. The band's reality was decaying behind the opulence of the farewell. In one way or another, every member was having difficulties. Drinking, drugs, fatigue, a lack of trust, and a lack of dependability. Later, Robertson recalled feeling as though he was standing inside something that was already burning and knowing he had to leave before it fell apart entirely as he saw their musical skill ebb and go. There was more to The Last Waltz than just the music. It covered the expense. For long enough, the camera captured it. Hands that wouldn't stop shaking, bodies that were stretched to their limits, and hollowed-out faces. It was impossible to overlook Richard Manuel's condition. Sometimes he had to take drugs simply to keep his composure long enough to finish a performance. Nothing was concealed. Nobody pretended that it didn't occur. It unfolded in plain view and was captured on film for all time. The damage solidified instead of fading when the lights went down. The cracks inside the band did not mend after the movie. They got bigger. Whatever hope there was for a true reconciliation slowly vanished. In March 1978, the original five did make one final appearance on stage together, performing an unscheduled encore following a solo presentation by Rick Dano. It was fleeting, brittle, almost hesitant. There were no statements or speeches, just music and then quiet. Then it was forever finished. There was no closure after that. It was defeat. In 1986, Richard Manuel committed suicide. After several years, Rick Dano left in 1999. Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm's distance from one another never closed. After the split, they hardly spoke to each other at all. It went by. Decades were piled on top of years. Robertson looked back and admitted that Helm had always wanted someone to blame for his rage. In the end, it was him if it wasn't the manager, the agency, or the attorney. Helm's resentment was so intense that he declined to go to Dano's burial. whether Robertson would be present. Things had progressed to that extent. But something changed at the last end. When Helm's health deteriorated in 2012, the two men reconnected. Robertson subsequently revealed that he visited New York and spent a considerable amount of time sitting with Helm in the hospital. He remembered the amazing, lovely moments they had spent together, the music and the connection that seemed indestructible at the time. He recounted being greeted with warmth by Amy, Helm's daughter, whom he had known since birth. He said that Helm was one of the most amazing talents he had ever encountered and that he had always felt like an elder brother to him. The affection had never really faded, and he was thankful for the opportunity to see him one last time. On April 19, 2012, at the age of 71, Levon Helm passed away due to complications from throat cancer. Robbie Robertson came over 10 years later. After battling prostate cancer for a year, he passed away in Los Angeles on August 9, 2023, at the age of 80. Ultimately, there was no clear-cut solution. Just two men who, together, created something eternal. Discovered serenity only when there was nearly no time left, and spent years unable to stand in the same place. Feuds may end quietly. They just run out of energy. Why didn't Robbie Robertson refer to it as a conflict with Levon Helm? Robbie Robertson never agreed that his relationship with Levon Helm was characterized by a conflict, even though they stood side by side for many years. Actually, no. Not in the tidy, dramatic manner that folks liked to recount it afterwards. Because the word was practical and simplified a complex concept, it became instantly recognizable. Their past was rich and complex, the kind that doesn't vanish when things come apart. Robertson often returned to the same reality when questioned about Helm. Helm, he thought, was the nearest thing he had ever had to a brother. Their relationship went beyond music. It overflowed into everything. The creative and the personal were so intertwined that it was impossible to separate them. Closeness, according to Robertson, is precisely what allowed them to produce something that no one else could ever match. The friendship was sustained by the music. The music was nourished by the friendship, but it was delicate, beautiful but delicate because it all shared a small space. Even after everything fell apart, Robertson believed that bond was valuable. According to him, there was never a feud in the conventional sense. There were no two men engaged in open combat that he saw. He observed Helm's mental, financial, and personal struggles. According to Robertson, Helm developed habits in the years following the band's heyday that made it challenging to hold him accountable. "I do it out of habit, not cruelty." Resentment had a way of finding another place to land, and he believed Helm struggled to look inward. According to Robertson, two people must actively swing during a fight. That was never what he thought was going on between them. However, tension can develop without mutual consent. Both men had already lived near peril long before the money, the credits, and the resentment. They never mentioned drugs in passing. They were interwoven with its fabric. In the beginning, drugs clouded judgment and recklessly bonded the group. Things were later hollowed out. Trustworthiness diminished. Trust waned. A shared rebellion gradually turned into a source of pressure, particularly as every weakness was accentuated by success. Not all of that pressure came at once. It boiled. Robbie Robertson had always had a complicated life. Born on July 5, 1943, Jamie Royal Robertson was the son of Rosemary Dolly Chrysler, a Kaga and Mohawk woman who grew up on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve close to Hamilton, Ontario. Later, she worked at the Carraro jewelry plating factory in Toronto's Cabbagetown neighborhood, where she met and wed James Patrick Robertson in 1942. Together, they raised their only child while working long hours and relocating through various Toronto neighborhoods. During his childhood, Robertson frequently accompanied his mother on family visits to the Six Nations Reserve. It was there that he was first drawn to music. He learned to play the guitar from Herb Mike, his older cousin. The rest came from the radio. Late nights spent hearing voices crackling in from Buffalo and Nashville, rock and roll bleeding through static, and rhythm and blues drifting across borders. He was made by those sounds, not just amused. When I was 12, things changed once more. Robbie's mother revealed his biological father's identity to him during the divorce proceedings between her and James Robertson. She had dated Jewish-American gambler Alexander David Kligerman prior to her marriage. Before Robbie was born, he had been killed in a hit-and-run collision. She quickly made arrangements for her son to meet his paternal uncles. They made sure he felt like family by swiftly drawing him into their world. Another layer was added too soon, teaching us about conflicting allegiances and intricate relationships. Childhood was not where those patterns remained. They followed him into adulthood, influencing his relationships, dedication, and control-giving style. Relationships were never straightforward by the time Robertson reached adulthood. Love and loyalty were important, but they frequently coexisted with ambition, distance, and a desire to lead rather than follow. At the height of the band's success, on March 24, 1968, he wed Canadian journalist Dominique Bourgeois. Amidst the turmoil of fame, touring, and creative pressure, they formed a family together. Sebastian was their son, and they had 2 daughters. However, the same factors that put stress on the band also put stress on the marriage. They suffered from long distances, creative obsession, and the demands of leadership. The divorce was the result of yet another bond failing to withstand the imbalance in the marriage. Robertson discovered a different kind of collaboration years later. He married Canadian restaurateur, Top Chef Canada judge, and entrepreneur Janet Zuccarini on March 12, 2023, following 4 years of dating. It was more private, more subdued, and more about grounding than momentum. Even though they married 5 months before he passed away, his loved ones believed it was a deliberate decision. A man who had been moving for decades, finally deciding to remain motionless. Robertson dedicated his life outside of his relationships to causes that aligned with his principles. He participated in Artists Against Racism and used his position to promote public awareness campaigns and anti-racism initiatives. It reflected the same spirit that pervaded both his leadership and his music. The individuals closest to Robertson were shocked when he passed away early on August 9, 2023. According to reports, he had been fighting prostate cancer for a year or so, but his cause of death was never made public. According to those close to him, he appeared to be doing fairly well until his wife took him to the hospital the previous day. He died surrounded by his children, his wife, and his ex-wife. Robertson's 3 adult children sued his wife in May 2024, claiming undue influence and elder abuse. Legal documents that would provide her with financial support after his death were allegedly signed during a time of severe health decline, allegedly without his children's full knowledge or consent. Once more, the narrative focused on trust, control, and who has the right to speak when others are unable to. It was a well-known conclusion. Because it was simpler than the truth, the feud narrative endured. The truth was messier and slower. Silence, ambition, drugs, and brotherhood bind these 2 men. One who thought that the only way to prevent everything from burning down was to have structure. Another person believed that structure was stealing something necessary. Not entirely correct, not entirely incorrect. They did not ruin one another. They lived longer than the version of themselves that was once cohesive. Furthermore, there was no easy way to return by the time the music eventually stopped. How do you feel about Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson's feud? Tell us by leaving a comment below. Remember to subscribe, share, and like. Click the video that appears next on your screen as well. You'll delight.